A single mother gets into a war of words with her neighbor, only to discover that the guy is her crush. In the opening scene, we see Noel, a single mother, decorating the living room with Christmas ornaments. After putting the last decoration on the Christmas tree, she checks her messages, only to see a voicemail from her ex-husband. Noel wants her son to spend Christmas with her, but Greg thinks their home is more suitable for Henry. Henry sits on the stairs listening to his father's voicemail, making sure to stay hidden until he gets called by his mother. Looking at the small tree in front of them, Noel apologizes to her son for being less than what he's used to, but promises him the best Christmas he's ever had. Aware of the whole situation, Henry assures her that they will indeed have the best Christmas ever. Taking his ball, he leaves the house, and we get to see the other side of the neighborhood. We are introduced to Jeremy, a rather grumpy guy who doesn't like Christmas. Shutting off the Christmas music, he plays his classical number while sitting in peace. However, his peace is disturbed once he hears loud thuds on the wall. Getting outside, he sees Henry kicking the ball against his wall. Jeremy warns him that he'll confiscate it, but Henry doesn't care. Jeremy runs after him, but Henry has the advantage, given that Jeremy's walking with a cane. Henry manages to get away as Jeremy gets stopped by Louis. Returning home, he drags his mother to the new bakery to get some banana bread. Jeremy returns home, and as he's about to join a conference call, he hears the doorbell. Annoyed at the doorbell, he decides to answer the door after a couple of rings, only to see some children trying to sing a Christmas carol to him. He tries explaining that he doesn't have time, but they don't listen, which only makes him slam the door in their faces. After getting some treats from the bakery, Henry decides to let his mother know about the situation with the neighbor from 224, but makes sure not to mention that it's his fault. Shocked at the neighbor's actions, Noel asks him to stay away from the guy. As they get to their house, they see Shannon, Noel's sister, and her daughter at the front, visibly upset. Shannon explains how the neighbor slammed the door in their face, and Henry reveals that it's the same guy who chased him. As they get inside, Shannon asks her whether she's ready to go on her blind date. In the evening, as Noel's working, she sees Jeremy park in the handicapped spot, and not taking a full look at him, assumes that he's a jerk. As he gets in, she tries to confront him. That is, until she sees his cane and apologizes. This is the first time they meet, and a spark appears between them. As he heads out, she calls out for him to get his change, but he lets her keep it, claiming that she deserves it. As he heads home, he stops to collect his mail, which is right next to the Christmas tree. Same as Noel, Jeremy has the problem of people trying to set him up on blind dates. As if his friends nagging isn't enough for him to get pissed off, Jeremy trips on a cable and falls directly on the ground. Louis starts apologizing, claiming that it's just for the tree that everyone wanted. But unfortunately, Jeremy makes him promise that he'll take it down. Calming down, Jeremy opens up about the stroke he had, and how it impacted his life in general. But his friend assures him that a date with Haley might change that. Playing the piano, Jeremy feels his handicapped arm stiffen up, so he decides to get some medication. As he gets the needed meds, he heads to the cereal aisle, where he spots Noel. He tries avoiding her, but she calls out his name. Her flirting is noticeable as they engage in a conversation, and he seems to be nervous. Admitting to being conflicted, she asks for advice on which cereal to pick. He suggests oatmeal, but she asks for something more fun. They mention some cereal from their childhood, and the commercials are about them on TV, which makes them laugh. As Noel chooses her cereal, a child proceeds to make fun of Jeremy's hand, which only makes him want to run away from the situation. On her way back, Noel stops by her mailbox, only to see Louis taking the tree down. She is shocked to hear that Mr. Gier wanted the tree to be taken, and putting two and two together, she realizes that it's the neighbor from 224. Later in the evening, Noel arrives at Shannon's, only to be told some interesting things about her blind date. They let her know that Bert is a total nutcase, and her sister reveals that he's been blocked from all social media platforms due to spreading misinformation. Despite not wanting to meet him, Noel stays, and they have a rather awkward night. As they meet, he doesn't want to shake her hand due to germs, so he gives her a fist bump. As they sit down to enjoy dinner, Noel tries to shift the conversation from his beliefs by asking whether any of them have read any good books recently. However, this backtracks to her, as they start arguing whether fiction is good or not. As if the bad date hasn't been enough, Noel receives a call from her ex-husband, trying to change her mind about him spending Christmas with Henry. Again, not knowing that Henry is listening to her, Noel doesn't choose her words as she hangs up the call on him. The following morning, her sister Shannon comes by and apologizes for the previous night. Noel informs her that she's never going on blind dates again, and insinuates that she already has a crush on someone. Coming down the stairs, Jeremy stops by the mirror before going on a date with Haley. The fancy restaurant appears to have no free tables, so they decide to go to the diner down the street. As they get to the diner, he stops for a second, realizing that's where Noel works. Despite not wanting to be seen with another woman, he decides to go in. As Noel sees him, her heart breaks, and she can't believe what's happening for a second. Haley sits down, but as Jeremy's trying to get his coat off, his arms start to stiffen up. He struggles to take his jacket off, and instead of helping him, she informs him that he's making a scene. Knowing that nothing will come out of the date, Jeremy tries to be polite and calls it quits. However, she takes it the wrong way and leaves immediately. Reading the room, Noel goes by his table to take his order. He tries to leave, but she asks him to stay, so he lets her choose the order. Bringing him a warm slice of apple pie and hot chocolate, she joins him, and they share the piece. Opening up, he lets her know that he was supposed to be on a blind date, so she decides to tell him all about her blind date from the previous night. He assumes that a lot of guys want to take her out, giving him a flirtatious look. She lets him know that she doesn't want those guys. The flirtation goes both ways as they indulge in a conversation, resulting in Noel forgetting that she's at work until her coworker reminds her. As she goes back to doing her job, he gets ready to leave. In the meantime, Shannon walks into the lounge and passes by him without even seeing him. Excited about her new crush, Noel lets her sister know that her crush is there, but as she points to where he was sitting, he is gone. Lucky for Noel, given that Jeremy is the grumpy neighbor from 224. The following day, Jeremy is sitting in his living room listening to some classical music when he hears loud thuds. Annoyed, he gets up and confronts Henry, threatening him that he'll be in a lot of trouble if he continues. But the little kid doesn't care, and even calls him a grumpy old Scrooge. Jeremy runs after him once again, but Henry throws a snowball at him. His friend passes by his house and decides to ask about his date with Haley. Given the embarrassment he went through, he decides not to talk about it, so his friend asks him not to give up. As he heads back inside, he takes the advice from his friend and gathers the courage to see Noel. Entering the cafe where Noel works, he notices a rather rude guy talking to her. Noel is visibly uncomfortable as the guy keeps trying to get her phone number, making nasty comments. Jeremy decides to step in. The guy finally leaves, embarrassed, and Noel thanks Jeremy for saving the day. He explains that it's a win-win situation for him. If he were to get hit, she would feel bad for him and eventually give him her number. Even though he's joking, he is serious when it comes to her number, and surprisingly, she writes it down on a paper for him. It is evident that she likes him as well. He tries to leave smoothly, but ends up forgetting his order out of excitement, so they both laugh about it. Noel is decorating her house with Christmas ornaments when she gets a call from an unknown number. Answering the phone, she realizes that it's Jeremy from the cafe. He has finally gathered enough courage to call, but when it comes to making conversation, he seems to be unprepared. Noticing how nervous he is, she decides to make it easier for the both of them by suggesting they meet in person. Pleasantly surprised, he's at a loss for words, but he imagines to pull through by claiming that he knows just the spot. Later in the evening, we see them at a skating rink. She notices that he's used to the ski life, and he reveals that he grew up at a lake, so that's why he's very skilled at it. Unintentionally, he reveals that he had a stroke, and it shocks Noel. Even though it's a tragic thing that happened to him, he admits that sliding has become a lot easier for him. Noel gets cold, so they decide to sit down somewhere. As they sit by the fire, warming themselves up, Jeremy takes notice of the classical music that's playing in the distance. To be honest, Noel reveals that classical music is a bit boring for her, and he can't believe she thinks that. He begins talking about music in such a passionate way that she considers going back to it. Given the good vibes, he asks for the date to be extended. But she makes an uncomfortable face. Thinking that he's crossed the line, he apologizes, but she decides to tell him the truth. Informing him that she's a divorced single mother, she thinks that she might have ruined her chances with him, but he assures her that he has no problem with it. He even is a divorced guy, but he has no children. Given that the truth is out, they establish that they don't have any problems with their personal lives, so Jeremy decides to take her to a special place. They enter an empty theater, and as they sit down, beautiful classical music starts playing, which gives Noel goosebumps. After the concert, they talk about their experience, and Jeremy mentions that he's loved music since he was a child. He reveals he's a composer. The stroke has affected him, but it didn't stop him from composing, and he's even hoping that his symphony will be accepted by the orchestra so he can relaunch his music career. Wanting to assure him that she's serious about their relationship, she asks to be his date for the concert next year. With a smile on his face, he promises to keep the best seat in the house for her. They start leaning into each other, but right as they're about to kiss, a Santa Claus appears out of nowhere asking for donations. Henry wakes up the next morning as happy as ever, that is, until he notices that his bunny isn't in its cage. Trying not to panic, Noel and Henry search the house for the bunny, but can't seem to find it, so they decide to print flyers and put them all around town with the reward of $50. On the other side of the neighborhood, though, hell is about to break loose. As Jeremy comes down the stairs, he sees a bunny in his room and wonders how it got in. He struggles to catch it, but manages to do so in the end, which is why he calls Lewis for help. Inspecting the rabbit, Lewis notices that it's not just a random rabbit, but rather Henry's pet. Instead of agreeing that it's just a coincidence, Jeremy fully believes that Henry intentionally let the rabbit into his house. Furious, he decides to write a note to the parents, threatening to call the wildlife authorities if the sewer rat ever crosses his path again. Not having any other choice, Louis grabs the bunny and takes it to Noel and Henry. Henry is delighted to see the bunny, but Louis warns him about the threats of Mr. 224. As he leaves, Louis hands Noel the written note, but Noel claims not to have time for the man. Later in the afternoon, Henry decides to throw his ball at Jeremy's wall, as he's trying to calm down from the bunny situation. Jeremy walks out, furious, and confronts him. Raging, Henry kicks the ball at Jeremy, but he ends up catching it and stealing it from him. Henry runs home to his mother and lies that he hasn't done anything wrong, so Noel promises to get it back for him. Simultaneously, Noel texts Jeremy, still not knowing that he's the actual neighbor from 224. To freshen up, Jeremy decides to take a walk, but he ends up bumping into his ex, and things don't go smoothly. She asks him to be civil, so he decides to just walk off. Back at Noel's house, she decides to respond to Mr. 224, so she writes him a nice letter asking him to return to the ball and to apologize for his bad behavior. As if the bad neighbor hadn't been enough for Noel, she gets a visit from her ex-husband at work. She asks him to step outside so they can have a chat, and he reveals that he and his new girlfriend are engaged. To make matters worse, he asks Noel to give him Henry for Christmas so they have a more homey feel to their house, because they're a family. Fuming, she denies his request, so he informs her that she'll be hearing from his attorneys. As Jeremy returns home in the evening to get ready for his date, he discovers his door mangled with and hijacked, so naturally, he calls Louis. Louis confirms that someone has hijacked his lock, and will have to get tweezers to take it out. Oblivious to the whole thing, Noel gets ready for the date when Henry comes into her room. She informs him that she's going on a date, but that she doesn't know anything about the guy. Being the concerned kid that he is, Henry assumes that he's a serial murderer. Louis reveals that someone has stuck a toothpick in his lock, so Jeremy assumes that it's the kid from 202. Instead of controlling his anger, he decides to go talk to the mother, not aware of what he's getting himself into. As they get down the stairs, Noel admits to liking the guy and having real feelings for him. Henry is happy for her and is proud to see her smile again. The door rings, so Noel tells Henry to go upstairs. As she opens the door, she is surprised to see Jeremy standing there, but not as much as he is shocked to see her standing at the door. He reassures himself that she's the lady from 202, but before he can say anything else, Henry sees him and starts screaming that he's the bad neighbor. Noel calms him down and introduces him as her date, but Henry reveals that he is the neighbor that has done horrible things to him. Not taking the lies, Jeremy reveals his side of the story, about how much the kid has been tormenting him, even revealing that he shot the ball at his head. However, Henry manages to get away with it by lying, and Noel believes him. After sending him to bed, she turns to Jeremy, who continues with his story, which is the truth. He even admits to coming because of the toothpick, but she cancels the date and slams the door in his face. Opening the door once again gives him hope, but she ends up just shoving the note into his hands before slamming it again. As she enters the living room, Henry starts apologizing to her. She assures him that she would never date anyone who didn't like him, but Henry claims that his father already does. He reveals overhearing a conversation where she talks about how much trouble he makes, and he even admits to it. Right as he's about to tell the truth, the doorbell rings, snapping him out of it. Jeremy doesn't seem to be taking the situation well, and the first thing he does is grab a bottle of alcohol to cope with the pain. Noel, however, calls her sister over and they have a chat. Both of them can't believe that Jeremy is the guy from 224, but Shannon believes that he's not a bad guy after all, and thinks that she should talk to him. Nevertheless, Noel claims that she needs to focus on her child and holiday only. The morning is rough for Jeremy, as he gets woken up by his friend as the hangover starts kicking in. His friend informs him that the whole neighborhood is talking about him and Noel, so Jeremy explains the situation to him. Instead of judging, his friend gives him real advice, which is to understand that Henry is her #1 priority, and to apologize for starters. Wanting to make things right for her child, Noel ends up calling her ex-husband and asking him to take Henry after dinner on Christmas so he can spend time with both of his families. Henry decides to make things right as well, and he apologizes to Jeremy for tormenting him and lying about it. He also admits to putting the toothpick in his keyhole, and Jeremy even applauds him for the genius idea. Before he leaves, he asks Jeremy to invite Noel for another date, but Jeremy claims that she's too good for him. He decides to return what's not his, and hands the ball over to Henry. Not having anyone to practice with, Henry asks him to do some shots, and Jeremy agrees. Serving breakfast, Noel calls out for her son, but he seems to be out. Exiting the house, she looks for him until she sees him playing ball with Jeremy. Going over to them, she takes Henry back and smiles at Jeremy. As they get inside the house, Henry comes clean about everything. She is visibly devastated at losing Jeremy, but she hides it so she doesn't upset her kid. Later in the evening, Jeremy decides to ask Louis for a favor that will bring light to the town. After finishing the job, he heads to Noel's. As she opens the door, he lets her know that Henry is a special kid, and that she should be proud of him. As he's about to leave, she stops him and asks what he has against Christmas. After some hesitation, he reveals that he had a stroke on Christmas exactly 3 years ago, and that it's a trauma for him. Feeling sorry for him, she assures him that Henry considers him a friend, and asks him to join them on Christmas morning. Pleasantly surprised, he promises to be there. As Henry wakes up and runs to the tree in the morning, the doorbell can be heard. Opening the door, they see Jeremy with presents in his hands. They spend Christmas morning like a true family, with lots of laughter and presents. In the evening, as they stand by the kitchen counter, Noel thanks him for making Christmas special for them, and he calls her an angel. Romance is in the air once again, so they lean in to share their first kiss, but unfortunately, Henry comes running down the stairs. Given that there's still a little time before Henry gets picked up, Jeremy suggests they finally see the surprise he's been preparing with Louis. With their eyes closed, they walk to where Jeremy's taking them. And once he asks them to open up, they're shocked to see the Christmas tree in front of them. Family and friends wish them Merry Christmas as the lights shine from the tree. Turning to Jeremy, she thanks him for the gift as he kisses her for the first time. We are taken to a year later, where Jeremy's composition is being performed. Noticing that he's nervous, she leans in and lets him know how proud she is of him. But he lets her know that he couldn't have done it without her, and the fact that she's there makes it more special. Their love thrives as they show support for each other even a year later, and they prove it by sharing a sweet kiss.